All right, everyone. It is 2 o'clock, so I'll go ahead and get us started. Good afternoon. I am Taylor Post, Swiflin's office manager, and I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, The Story of Us, How We Impact Our Communities, and today's presenter, Linda Bruno. Linda has been developing and conducting training workshops for libraries and other organizations for more than 15 years. She offers workshops on topics ranging from leadership skills to returning balance and lots of areas in between. Linda received her MBA from the University of Florida and has years of experience in hands-on management positions. She develops her workshops based on solid research and, more importantly, real-life application. Linda is also certified with DDI and Achieve Global. Please welcome Linda Bruno and enjoy her webinar this afternoon.
Thanks so much, Taylor, and welcome everybody to today's Story of Us, how we impact our communities. Let me just start off by saying this is technically a part of Library Staff Day. We just happen to be doing it a little bit differently this year. But if any of you have ever been in any of my sessions at Library Staff Day, you know they revolve around discussion and interaction, and that just makes it so much richer for everybody. And the same applies to any webinar, but particularly to this one today, because I developed it still with the idea of it being a staff day representation. Whether or not you would have been at staff day, we're thrilled that you were able to make it today online. But I do ask that you participate in the chat box as we go through today's handouts, because what you will end up with after the webinar is over, if you are engaging in the discussion in the chat and you're keeping notes, is a lot of different ways to use your stories, to collect your stories. What stories are you looking at? Those kinds of things. So there's going to be a wealth of information for you in today's session. I will also say that when I'm face to face with you all, if you don't discuss, I stand and stare at you. And although that is very effective face to face, it doesn't work so well when we're online, because you can be popping popcorn for all I know. So I'm just going to ask as a favor to me if you would please engage today and join the discussion. And part of the reason I want you to join the discussion is when you do that, especially on this kind of a topic, you give me additional information that I can use with other library staff when we talk about stories throughout the state of Florida, because it's become so important. And one thing that popped into my head just a few minutes before we got started was a conversation that I had about 2 years ago with somebody. We were talking about stories as just a piece of another workshop that I was doing. And she came up to me at break and she had this concerned look on her face and she said, "I need to ask you something." And I said, "What's that?" And she said, "I was just talking to somebody last week about stories, and that person said stories are not relevant. They're not important. Don't even bother about stories." And I almost took a physical step back. And I said, "Well, number one, I'm going to have to agree to disagree with this person, because I firmly believe in stories." And we talked about it for a few minutes, and she was nodding her head yes the whole time, so I knew she felt the same way I did. But a little bit later, another idea came to my mind, and I walked up to her and I said, "So let me just ask you something. When you read a nonfiction book, because the stories we tell in our libraries, other than it's story time, are not fiction, are they? They're real life happenings." And I said, when you read a nonfiction book for you to grow personally, what captures your attention in the first page or two? And she kind of looked at me a little puzzled. And I said, "Well, for me, when I'm reading a book like that, if there isn't a story that captures my attention within the first at least chapter, chances are I won't even finish reading the story." And I want you to think about that, or reading the book. If your library is functioning in an environment of just statistics and just services and just programming, you still have people come to your library, but you likely don't have them as engaged and enthusiastic and loyal and advocating for you and all those kinds of things. So that's one of the reasons that I think stories are so important. But we're going to work through that together. So if you've got your handouts there, the very first question is for you all. Why do you think it's important to encourage and collect? Do you see that extra word? Not just encourage stories in your library, but also collect them. Why would that be important in your library, do you think? Would you type into the chat box whatever comes to mind? And with stories, there are no right or wrong answers. This is not a cut and dried, let's take a quiz kind of a thing. It's just to flesh out the really good information that's going to help us today. Authenticity, absolutely, Maureen. How can you tell everybody in your community how important your library is if you don't have any, I'm going to call it proof for that, right? The proof is what makes you authentic. You can give them statistics until the cows come home. A good Midwestern term there for you. But it's not going to matter to the people in your community. Are statistics important? Absolutely. We all know that. But in your community, those statistics aren't nearly as meaningful as the stories that you can tell about the ways you impact your community, because that's what the title of this webinar is, how we impact our communities. I see a lot of good answers coming in. I want to go back and catch that. Sarah said to inspire others. Yes, sometimes, Sarah, don't tell anybody, but it's to inspire our own staff, isn't it? It's to inspire our employees, the people working in the library. Because at any job, most any job, I don't work at every job, so I can't say that 100%. But at a lot of jobs, we may love what we do, we may be enthusiastic about what we do, but there are days when we don't feel as inspired. And so stories help inspire the staff, the community, the patrons, the people that fund us. Nicola said for inspiration and motivation. Absolutely. And Margie said to engage the community, because when they know you're collecting stories, they want to be part of your story, don't they? Andrea said it personifies an organization. Yes, it does, Andrea. I have never seen a statistic that personifies an organization. Have you all? I don't think so. And again, I'm not belittling statistics because they're very necessary. I keep statistics in my own work. But what really touches my heart and keeps me encouraged and inspired and motivated is the fact that I get stories from some of you. And when I get those, I typically collect them, even though I'm the only person in my world, as far as in my work world, in my office. I'm self-employed, so it's just me. I don't have an assistant, but I keep them because I need that. Gina said to get a picture and an idea of the community. Yes, because it changes, doesn't it, Gina? So if we say, okay, for the month of October, we're going to collect stories. That doesn't tell us anything for the month of February, does it? Maybe a little bit. But when we collect those stories on an ongoing basis, we can even start to sense changes within our community because of the stories we're collecting. And Eric said social connection, a face. Oh, we need that, don't we? I love webinars. I've been doing webinars for over 15 years, but there's nothing quite like face-to-face, is there? I was on a meeting the other day and I was not the presenter. I was attending a meeting and the person said, if you can turn on your webcam, please do so. It's just so nice to see a face. So absolutely, you can put a face with a story, can't you? Without even identifying the people involved in the story. Most of the time that wouldn't be an issue, but if there are privacy concerns or whatever, you don't have to give real names, but you can certainly give a very rich description that captures people's attention. So thank you for sharing. Now you have upped my expectations for you to share the rest of the time. And Marcia said this is part of reaching out to the communities, especially how the community spends their time. Absolutely. And S says they like seeing themselves, free PR when they see their stories and pictures. Yes. And some of those you won't even have stories and pictures to, I'm going to use air quotes, print, whether that's on social media or you actually make flyers with it or whatever. But you might have stories collected on the bulletin board in your lunchroom, stories collected in a recipe box so that everybody can go back and say, you know, if Linda's having a bad day on a Tuesday morning, I can go back and say, I just need to read a couple good stories. And I can go back and do that because we're collecting them. So wonderful answers there. Thank you so much for sharing. I put down some as well, and you've captured, I think, most of them, but I just want to go through them and make sure we know the importance of this, because here's the thing. Life is busy right now. life has been busy for years for most of us, but it's just really kind of wonky right now. And if we don't have a good, compelling reason to do something different than we've always done, then we won't do something different than we've always done. Now, I know you're all aware of stories and you've always been aware of your stories, but have you actually encouraged them and collected them? And that's what we're here to make sure we're taking steps forward on today. So I put down, it takes the pulse of the community. And somebody mentioned that earlier. I think Gina said to get a picture and an idea of the community. And it takes that pulse, doesn't it? Here's what's kind of cool. And I've had people tell me this. We started collecting stories, and there were things that kept popping up that we had never connected the dots on. I'm going to give you an example of this, and it didn't even come up in the context of stories. But several years ago, I was in a workshop. We were not talking about stories. I think we were talking about customer service. And one of the people said, here's something really odd that happened the other day at our library. We were sitting around the lunchroom, and somebody said, I got the weirdest call from someplace in Michigan the other day. And this was in Florida. And somebody else in the same lunchroom said, I've gotten calls from Michigan. And a couple of other people commented, and then started asking each other questions. Was it from a lady? Was she in this area of Michigan? And so forth. And they determined that it was from the same person making these calls to the Florida library that we were meeting with. And so they decided they were going to find out why she called the library in Florida. So the next time she called, whoever got a hold of her said, we love that you call us, but we just have a question. Are you in Michigan right now? And she said, yes. And they said, well, can we ask why you tend to call a library in Florida? And she said, because when I was there a couple of years ago on vacation, I came to the library for something, and I've never felt so welcomed and so helped before in a library. And I just wanted to keep calling you all. She had even called one time to find out about a restaurant that was in her area in Michigan. She called the Florida Library. And I just love that. But the fact that even though that person wasn't in their community, the fact that they started to share that story kind of took a pulse for how they serve their customers, didn't it? And I just thought that was a really cool thing for people to be able to share, is that 1,000 miles away, probably more like 13 or 1,400 miles away, that you can find your commonality of how you serve people. Number two says it helps other people see what you see. And some of you alluded to that. You may not have worded that exact way, but you all know how wonderful your library is. And sometimes you have to make it obvious to other people about how wonderful your library is. And that's not always the easiest thing to do unless you encourage and collect stories. It shows how your library has changed. And I put a little asterisk beside this one just this morning, and I put, and continues to change. I'll bet there were some people that were stunned by the way you all stepped up to the plate during this time and served your customers, your patrons, in a way that they never would have expected. As a matter of fact, let's take a second right now. First of all, just a very brief, a few words. How are you currently operating in your library? Are you closed with curbside service? Are you doing phone only? Are you full service right now? First, that's my first question. But what have you done differently during the pandemic that may or may not have surprised somebody? You don't know for sure that it surprised them, but it might have caught them off guard. Engaged, curbside, closed with curbside, full service with limited capacity, 10-person capacity curbside, virtual programs, phone and curbside, limited capacity curbside service, full service, open to the public, limited capacity since June 8th. So you can see the array we have there, and all of that is still in flux, isn't it? I actually have been getting most of my groceries from Walmart's pickup service, which I had never used before. And I know they've had it for a while, but they've actually changed the way they do it now, so it's contactless. And I was talking to a neighbor of mine who shops at Walmart all the time, and she drives there and goes inside, and that's great. I just didn't want to do that right now. And she said, "Do they actually bring it to your car?" And I said, "Yeah, they bring it to the car, and I open the trunk before they get there, and they put it in the trunk, and they knock on my trunk and tell me I'm done." And she looked at me like, "Wow, that's kind of cool." And here they've been doing that for months, and she didn't even know that. Same thing happens with our libraries, doesn't it? We do things for months, years sometimes, and people don't even realize it. Open 3 days, curbside 1 day, closed 1 day for sanitizing materials. Lots of variety in how we're interacting with our communities right now. So tell me one thing. Can you think of a story of something that you've done that surprised somebody? Natalia said full service with a limited capacity since May 11th. Some patrons still are discovering that we are open. Yeah. And we need to keep encouraging that kind of being in front of them, if you will, letting them know how valuable we are, even beyond the pandemic. And I hope that's soon. But even beyond the pandemic, we need to make sure that we keep top of mind. Gee, there were a lot of people that didn't even know some of the things we did. How can we continue to let them know how valuable we are? So I see that Megan is typing, and maybe she's typing in a story. So grateful and thankful that we are open the days we are. Absolutely. No matter what that is, right? What's one what you would consider a small thing? And here's what I often hear when I talk about stories. Yeah, but it's just our job. Well, to be enthused and engaged and inspired by your job, you need to be reminded sometimes of the cool things you do. The notes that I get from people, I'm just doing my job when somebody sends me a note and tells me that I've made a difference for them. But it always makes me just so soul deep happy that sometimes I get tears in my eyes. I need to be reminded of that to stay inspired. The plethora of digital content for customers that they had no idea. And as we talk about stories throughout this session today, I want you to start thinking about how you can get specific, because see, that's what happens. We say, oh, we've got a lot of digital things for people. Oh, we learned how to do story time online, all those kinds of things. And that's exactly what happened. So I'm not saying that that's not what happened, but I want you to get so specific, and we'll look later at how to do that. I want you to get so specific, you start to recall the people involved in some of these stories, because that's when it starts to sink in that you truly do make a difference. You already know that. I don't have to tell you that. But gosh, what a nice reminder from time to time to have those stories available to us. Reduced hours. And I'm going to keep pushing for little snippets of stories, because this is what I have found in the past, is that people look at me blankly when I'm face to face, like I said, they just think this is part of our jobs. And then when they start sharing stories among each other, they get excited for the other libraries that are represented, because you would be amazed at the vast variety of ways those stories come about in a library. Brent said we did a lot of reemployment applications. Oh, that's life-saving right now, isn't it, Brent? For patrons, some of which really could not even use the computer but needed to submit things digitally. Absolutely. And in our world assumes that everybody uses a computer, doesn't it? Our world assumes that everybody uses their smartphone for every little thing they do throughout the day. And I detest, I'm just going to say it right out, I detest using my smartphone for things. Not because I don't use it as a tool. I do, and it's very helpful. I've got Dropbox on there so I can pull my files when I'm out of town. I've got the things that are useful to me. But one of the things that just makes me simmer is when I start getting those push messages from places that I've downloaded an app that I need to use, like Verizon, which is my carrier, or I had AAA on for a while and they started giving me alerts at 3 o'clock in the morning that it might rain, kind of a thing. And so the fact that you can help somebody do something on the computer, and Brent, here's how you made a difference, Brent. They couldn't even use the computer, but you didn't make them feel that way, did you? There's the story, that you made them feel confident and proud of themselves and like they had learned something once they filled that information out digitally. And they now have walked away from your library thinking, That's something I never thought I could do, but Brent at the library helped me do that. And that is life changing because guess what? If nobody helps them, they can't apply for a job. That's pretty significant, isn't it? And yet, it's just part of our job. And we just really need to look deeper than that. Megan said on the days we're open, we've helped lots of patrons renew their food stamp cards and apply for unemployment. Yep. Waiving fees and offering free visitor cards. Online programs for story times for kids and adult programs. And you're all giving me great things that you're doing. But so far they're pretty general. Now I'm getting to S's. It says I shared with a customer who's always at the library her laptop. She overheard me talk about Hoopla with another customer and ask about it, and then immediately downloaded the app and started browsing it. There you go. That's specific, isn't it? We've also reduced operating hours, Yasmin said. Nicola said we finally instituted wireless printing and our patrons are very excited about that. And then you pull out the one patron who, again, would not have been able to do XYZ. Again, you don't have to name them. You can just say a man came in his 50s. He hadn't had to apply for a job for 25 years. He was able to print wirelessly and take that information to his job interview that day or whatever it was. And he came back 2 days later and told us he got the job. Are you hearing a deeper story there? Years ago, we had an instance in our community where 2 or 3 companies or organizations had laid off hundreds of people over the course of a couple of months. So the workforce board and the local college put together some training programs, and I got to help in that. And I was standing in a session one day helping a fellow fill out a paper resume so that he could then put it on the computer. I was asking him questions and getting information and helping him realize how valuable he had been at his job when I heard a couple of guys talking behind me. And the one guy said, I went home last night in tears. And the other guy didn't say anything. And he said, I had to tell my wife for the first time in 25 years that I wasn't going to be bringing home a paycheck. Still brings tears to my eyes. And I kind of froze because I thought, I'm going to deal with this. He has nothing to be ashamed of. And, all this stuff was going on in my mind. Before I could say anything, the other fella said, yeah, but it should make you feel better looking around this room knowing it wasn't you that caused that. And I thought, yay, human beings. But do you hear that story there? And then I was able to get to that fellow later in the day and give him some really good information for that resume. So that's what I want you to think about is how are you actually helping people? And it's not just for right now. And we're going to talk about why this is important here in a moment and how you can use this in the future. As said constantly, whoops, I see something about masks up here. Miami-Dade is currently handing out disposable and reusable masks. Good, because not everybody can afford to go out and buy masks right now. And that doesn't mean they don't want to come to the library. Constantly telling customers about scanning their documents instead of faxing if applicable. It saves money. Yeah, dollar page fax. They're so happy about that. I walk them through scanning and they're more than happy with the results. And guess what, S? They get to use that in the future, don't they? You've taught them a life skill. Claudia, many of us, myself included, have walked to different areas of downtown handing out masks. We handed many masks to areas where the homeless congregate, and they're all very grateful. Natalia says some people just happy even for attention. There you go. That's a story right there. There are people that are craving attention. Has nothing to do with reading. Once I handed an umbrella to a lady who was scared to get to her car. She was standing at the already closed door, covering her grandchild. So I gave her my umbrella. She was happy, was repeating the story. Ashamed she didn't know who gave her the umbrella when turning it back in. It was a little human attention. It made a kind of friendship between us. There you go. Those are the kinds of things I'm talking about. Now, people would look at you like, what's that got to do with being a library? It has to do with the fact that the people that work in libraries are some of the kindest, most caring, most compassionate, genuine people I personally have ever met. And that's what you need to convey to people, not to be bragging, not to be conceited about what you're doing, but again, and you will hear me say this again and again before we're done today, to let people know the value of your library. Because guess what? Funding is going to be an issue. We all know that. I'm not saying anything new. I'm not saying anything that's going to startle anybody. Funding is going to be an issue because of what we're going through right now. And these are the kinds of things that can help you shore up, if you will, the advocacy for your library. because when those discussions start to happen, you can call on some of these people where you've made a difference and ask them to, and I wouldn't use the word advocate when you're asking your patrons because sometimes that sounds too governmental ease, if you will. You might just say, we really need some help to make sure the people funding the library know how valuable we are. Would you mind signing this or writing a statement about what the library means to you? Those kinds of things. Constantly telling customers about scanning their documents instead of faxing. Yes, we talked about that one. Not charging for copies. Yep. One of our librarians FaceTimed with an 85-year-old patron who was on lockdown in New York City and walked him through Libby so he could download materials to his iPad, which I love the fact that he's got an iPad. That's exactly what we're talking about. Now, before the pandemic, because it's been a couple of years ago that I talked to this lady, she said, and I know, she said this to me, I know we don't always have time to do this, but she said, I have a fellow who is legally blind and is just once he's just hungry to stay engaged with what's going on in the world. So he calls me every morning before we get busy at the library and I read the newspaper to him. And other people in the room were kind of shaking their heads like, there's no way you can do that. We don't have enough time. And I get that. And she got that too. But she made it a point to make sure she arranged her other work, that she wasn't messing around, taking it too slow. She got her other work done so that she could set aside that time of those parts of the newspaper. And it was extensive. It wasn't just 5 minutes. It was usually 15 or 20 minutes where she would read the parts that he wanted. So as you hear the stories today and you see them in the chat box, use them. Just because it didn't happen at your library does not mean it's not a library story. So if it comes to somebody in the room who does not work with Margie or the librarian that FaceTimed with the 85-year-old, it's perfectly okay to say, I know a librarian in Florida that FaceTimed with a fellow to help him learn how to use Libby. Those are the stories that belong to you all because of your profession. You didn't have to be the person standing in the middle of the room when it happened, but use those stories. I have down that it gets more people in the door. Somebody mentioned something like that, where once this is over and we're back to normal, whatever that might look like, and libraries are open and we won't ever forget what we've gone through, but it's not top of mind anymore. There are going to be people in your community that come to the library that you may never have seen before because they heard from their friends and acquaintances some of the things that happened for them in the library during the pandemic. Sometimes your story just describes an exciting event or program. So many of us have heard stories about children who have trouble communicating. Sometimes they're on the autism spectrum, sometimes they're not. They just really have trouble communicating, or they have trouble reading. And we've heard many stories about therapy dogs, reading therapy dogs that come into the library, and moms who will stand there with tears running down their cheeks because their child has never read anything out loud before because they were intimidated by reading. But the dog doesn't judge them. And so they sit down with the dog and they read and they stumble over words, and the dog just lays there and puts the paw on top of their lap or whatever. And those are the kinds of events and programs we take for granted because we offer them in the library. But they're the kinds of events and programs that other people may not be aware of. It builds bonds, doesn't it? Look at the bonds that you've already mentioned when you talk about a friendship that developed because of an umbrella. And again, that's not library specific per se, except that it's so representative of how you interact with people. Did it not build a bond? If you never hear from the 85-year-old patron again, he will never, I think it was, yes, walked him through. He will never forget what happened, and that will build a bond for him. He will have a soft spot. Is it going to pay off? I'm using air quotes when I say that because that's what so much of society tells us should happen these days. Is it going to pay off? I don't know. I doubt it. I don't think he will leave that library, his estate, but stranger things have happened. And of course, we're never going to do it for that reason. So there may never be a real quote payoff. And yet in your heart, there certainly is a payoff, isn't there? So it does build bonds, like the lady with Michigan. That built a bond. And I'm sure her friends thought she was kind of strange calling Florida. But you know what? There are good reasons to do all of these things. It engages more partners. When other organizations in your community know about the things you are invested in, and I use that term in an emotional way rather than a monetary way, the things that you're invested in to make sure the people in your community are getting the best services, the best help that they can get, there could very well be partners in the community that want to collaborate then with you on something. And that's always a positive. Well, almost always. You want to make sure your collaborators have the same heart that you do, but it will engage more partners because of that. It connects the library to the soul of your community. And somebody said that early on. It connects your library to the soul of your community. Right now, everybody's souls are bare, aren't they? They're raw. Our nerves are on edge. We're weary. We're worn down. And a little aside here that has nothing to do with what we're talking about today, be careful of your inputs right now. And by that, I mean be careful of what you're allowing into your mind, because your mind has a tendency to look for the same things over and over again. And when you allow a bunch of negative stuff into your mind, that's what your mind will search for to help you filter all the things that are coming at you. And I don't know about you, but I don't want that kind of help from my mind. But it happens if I start focusing on the negative. So please be careful about that during this time, because it's really hard. I'm finding it hard. And some of you who've known me for a long time know that I'm a very positive person. I can usually talk myself right out of having a funny mood or a down mood. But even so, there have been some things that have happened in my neighborhood and things like that with everything else that's going on that I think, I just want to hibernate. I just want to move to a cabin in the woods, kind of a thing. So the more you can connect with the soul of your community, the better off you are in keeping yourself emotionally strong and healthy during this time. Keeps the focus on your library's mission. Oh, there's a new word. I mean, it's not a new word, but we haven't mentioned it yet today. How much of what you're doing is related to your mission in some way, to the why of your library being a library in your community? What's your why? What's your vision that the strategic plan probably put in place a year ago or 3 years ago or 5 years ago or however long it was? How can you relate that back to what you're doing for your community right now? And if it doesn't seem to relate because the mission or the vision is outdated, that's a great opportunity to open our eyes and say, you know what, maybe it's time we relook at our mission and our vision and our values. Because look at what this whole experience has shown us and what it tells us about who our library is at its heart. That didn't really make sense, did it? Who our library is at our heart. You get what I'm saying. I feel like your library is a person. It develops your public speaking skills. When you start sharing some of these stories, now we can't do this face to face today, but if we were at library staff today at the Hilton Garden Inn like we had hoped to be, and I would be calling on you to tell these stories, some of you would be squirming a bit in your seats, but you would be sharing the story because the story itself excites you. And that's how it can help you develop your public speaking skills. So I've listed 10, you've listed another 12, 15, 18 in the chat box. Is there anything that popped into your head that we didn't cover about why it's so important to encourage and collect stories in your library? Anything else that popped into your mind? Okay, I don't see anything popping up. So the next question is kind of a gotcha. We talked about if there was anything else, and we've already come up with a list of a couple of dozen things. So here's the question. Why don't we automatically collect our stories? Why do you think that is? We know how important they are. We've just looked at a couple dozen reasons, but most of us don't automatically collect them, do we? Why? And I'm asking that question because if we don't acknowledge why we're not collecting them, we'll never start collecting them. So you will have spent a very informative 90 minutes on today's webinar, but it won't make a difference within your library. And you all know my goal for you today is to leave here with an action plan. It may only be one thing you want to do differently, but I need you to take action when we're done here. And I can't make you do that. It has to be a choice for you, doesn't it? As said, generally falling down on documentation. You're exactly right. I'll do it later. Then we forget, don't we? And if it becomes, here's the cool thing though. Somebody earlier mentioned the 5 habits thing, that the webinar we had a while back. If it becomes a habit, it will just be something that you can't imagine not doing because you will get excited about them. Your collection will get so, I'm going to use the word rich again. Your collection will be rich and deep and full of really fun stuff that you will want to do it. Sarah said, if you're used to doing something, sometimes it doesn't seem like a big deal. Exactly. It's no big deal. It's my job, right, Sarah? And truly, it is. However, let's make it a big deal. Nicola said time constraints. And again, and we get caught up in the busyness. And I think that second part probably is truer, isn't it, Nicola? Because the time constraints become very small if it's just a habit and we have a process to do this, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, just a very simple process, jot it down, put it in the recipe box or wherever you put it. I'm going to suggest, and I know people are going to scream at me and throw rotten tomatoes virtually. However, I'm going to suggest that you not collect them only online. And the reason I say that is it disappears. It doesn't really, but it does from our vision, doesn't it? And sometimes it takes 2 or 3 steps to get to the stories if we've stored them online somewhere. And suddenly it's just, yeah, it was a cool webinar, but it's just too much trouble. So we want to be careful about what we do with them so that we make it a habit and so that there aren't as many time constraints. Advocates for your community, right? It's just who we are, right, Yasmin? It's just what we do. It's how I said, because we're all real kaleidoscope as a staff, and some are more pro people, others not so much. But you know what? It doesn't have to be everybody has to do this 3 times a month. It just is the people that understand the importance of it and get excited by it and are fed by it by collecting stories. Those are the people that collect the stories. Marcia said to answer the first question is share your talents with others. Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the reasons we want to do it. That's an extra, isn't it, Marcia? We want to share our talents and the talents of the library as a whole. Solution, have a clipboard at the desk with a short, quick form ready to go. Absolutely. Or, as I said, a recipe box. And the reason I'm saying, if you have a clipboard, I did this in my own work a couple of years ago because I had something I was working on and I tended to, I have to see everything in front of me that I'm working on at any one time, which sometimes is 2 or 3 things at one time, as you all know. And so there was one thing that I just kept shuffling to the side. And I finally got a lime green clipboard and came up with a template for the form. And that helped me through that process. I didn't have to use it after that, but it was a wise investment. So if it's going to be on a clipboard, make it something that's so vibrant people can't ignore it, right? With a short, quick form ready to go. And we'll look at the elements of the form that make it bing, 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 all done. So yes, there will be easy ways to do that. I put down from my own notes when I was taking my own notes, we don't even see the stories sometimes because it's, as somebody says, just what we do. We don't even see that. You've heard me pushing, haven't you? I have been obnoxious today. I hope not really obnoxious, but I've been a bit pushy about getting you to think deeper and not in such generalities about what you do in your library, because you just tend to not even see the depth of the stories that you are creating it. Or some of you today don't see the benefit. Maybe you just wanted to attend a webinar and, get away from the desk for 90 minutes. That's okay. I'm always glad to have you here. But maybe you just don't see the benefits of those stories. Or again, we just think that we're doing our jobs. So here's what I want you to hear though. There are a lot of really cool ways we can use the stories we collect once we get in the habit. And I'm not even looking at this as a dated thing. I'm looking at this as what we call an evergreen thing, where this is something where there might be stories 7 years from now from the pandemic of 2020 that you pull back out because it's relevant to whatever you're thinking about doing or whatever you're advocating for funding or whatever it might be. There is a library system, Alachua County, I believe, just north of me here in Ocala. And many years ago, we were talking about just customer service, and somebody pulled a little postcard out of their packet that they had with them that day. And she said, we use this in all of our branch libraries. Several years ago, an artist had painted pictures of all of the libraries and donated them to each library. So each library had a picture of its own building that it could hang in that library. And so when they decided they wanted the county commissioners to be aware of how valuable the library was, the Friends of the Library paid for all of this so that nobody could say they took public funding for this. But the Friends of the Library said, we'll make you up postcards and we'll reduce those artist renderings to the front of the postcard for your library only. And then on the back, we'll just have them pre-printed with, I love my library because, and I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember the exact wording and it just popped into my head today to mention it to you. I love my library because, and then it had 3 or 4 check marks. I found my favorite author, someone helped me with a job application or a computer or whatever it might be, and then it left a room for comments. And instead of having people mail the postcards, they would have them fill them out at the library and just turn them in at the desk. And then the directors of those libraries would go through them and pull out the ones that were relevant to the county commissioners. Because if somebody said it's too cold in the library, you don't need to send that to the county commissioner. And they would actually send them to the county commissioner. When they first started the program, one of the commissioners called up and said, why am I getting all these postcards? And the director said, because we want you to know the value of the library in the community. Pretty upfront, right? So just think about that. They weren't even specific stories, but those directors were making sure that the people that held the purse strings understood why the community valued the library. My scroll bar isn't advancing for me, so if I miss any of your comments, I apologize. I eventually find them, but it's not going up by itself. Maureen said, I'm not around patrons frequently, so I don't hear stories. So that's another great reason to collect them, Maureen. You know what, Maureen? This gives you a great opportunity to ask your coworkers to start collecting stories. And just tell them, I don't get to share in the stories very much, and I would love if you would collect some of your stories. Check in with them once a week. Anybody got any good stories? And then record them. Seriously, we underestimate how much the stories mean to others. And you know what, Sarah? I think we underestimate how much the stories mean to us. Because like so many of you have already said, we think it's just part of our job, and indeed it is, but it fills us as a human being. Here's one reason why. It has nothing to do with stories in the library, and yet, because we're human, it most certainly does. There are studies done every few years. They started 70 or 80 years ago, and they're still doing them. And it's to find out what people value in their jobs. And the answers now, because of social media and news in our face daily, 30 hours out of every 24, it seems like, the answers now have to do with job security and benefits and higher pay and those kinds of things, because we're being told that's what we need to be concerned with. And indeed, we all want that, no doubt about it. But underlying all of that, as one of the main answers that always turns up, is people want to feel valued and appreciated. And when you collect stories, if nobody else ever says a word to you about that story, it still makes you feel valued and appreciated, doesn't it? Because you know the person that was involved in that story appreciates you. So not just them, Sarah, but also us, right? Yasmin said humility, it's what we take pride in doing. Yeah, exactly. Nicola said we have index card at our circulation desk to document stories. Yay! Are they neon colored, Nicola? Because you're going to get a gold star if they are. Yay! Somebody in your library may have already heard me talk about this because now you're thinking, what's that got to do with anything? Well, I want you to look at the post-it notes on this slide, which I had no idea I had even put up there. Oh, good. Thank you, Nicola. But they're a lot more noticeable, aren't they? If all of those were just the pale yellow post-its or they were all white, they wouldn't stand out. Neon colored index cards. That's why I said the lime green clipboard. Neon colored index cards, and only used for that, capture our attention, don't they? Years ago, I was doing a program at the local college, and it was for upper level administration, which I'm going to be honest with you. I'm so glad to hear that, Nicola. I'm going to be honest with you. I was a bit intimidated. Many of the people in the room were PhDs. At the time I did this program, I did not have even my first college degree because I was very late in going to school and getting my degrees. But I know customer service inside out. I've done it in previous jobs. It's one of my passions. And so they asked me to speak and I did. And so what I decided to do was design a little, guess what, neon green sheet of paper. And since I was doing it on my own, I had to be thrifty about it. So I printed 6 sets of the customer comment note on one sheet of green paper. And then I cut them myself. And they were all cut evenly. I used a paper cutter and all that stuff. But it wasn't professional by any means. And it was a customer service award. And they were to give it to each other. So I had them in a nice, pretty basket. And there were probably 35 or 40 people in the room. And so I was handing them bunches of them as I was talking about this concept. And one of the fellows that I knew from previous work was not only a PhD, he was the head of one of the departments at the college and always just kind of a big personality, if you know what I mean. Nice enough, but just kind of overwhelming. And I thought, oh boy, I'm going to have to give some to him too, because I thought he's going to think, what a silly little idea. And so I gave them to him, and we stopped for a break shortly after that. And he was holding his, and he walked up to me and he said, I'd like to talk to you about these. And I went, oh no. And he said, do you have any more? I love this idea. And I was just so, do you hear the story in my voice? I was so excited about that. He said, I love the fact that if you come back here a month from now, you're going to see these little green slips on employee desks because they've been awarded by another employee. So that's why I'm talking about the colors. The out of the 3 communication styles, the visual, the auditory, and the kinesthetic, visual is the highest percentage of the population. And so whenever you can do anything visually that captures people's attention, it'll be more productive and more efficient for you. So that's why I said that. So how do you think we can use the stories? Just type something into the chat box. How can we actually use these wonderful stories we're going to collect? Because they're going to be pretty specific after I give you the formula for it. To source funding, absolutely. If any of you have ever been involved in grant writing, you know how important statistics are, but you also know that what can tug a person's heart when they're making decisions on grants is the grant that has a story. It can make the difference. If they only have $50,000 to give away and they have 50 applications and they're going to give out 10 grants of 5,000 each out of those 50 applications, they've got to find ways to narrow it down, don't they? Yes, shows importance of the library in the community. It reminds us of our why, and we all need that, don't we? Every human being needs to be reminded of their why. Community awareness. Invite patrons to come back while we're still closed. All of the above. To remind people in the community what the library offers. I don't want to talk over somebody's comment here. I have a couple more that haven't been mentioned yet. Okay, I don't see that comment popping up just yet. I had written down to start and end meetings for a couple of reasons. If you start a meeting with a great story, first of all, people aren't going to dread coming to the meetings as much. I won't say they won't dread them at all, but not as much. And secondly, don't make just one person responsible for collecting the story or sharing a story. Make that something that you expect at every meeting. Next week, Deb's going to bring a positive story. That causes Deb to look for positive stories, doesn't it? That causes everybody to be on the lookout for positive stories because maybe they don't know from week to week who's going to be asked to bring one. So everybody's on the lookout. We all can remember the negative stories. We'd have to get a filing cabinet to keep track of those, right? And yet they're only a teeny tiny percentage of all the positive stories, but that's what our mind remembers. We are wired that way from thousands of years ago. We're wired that way because back then being negative served us well, and our brains still have that part in them. So that's just the way we're all wired. We have to intentionally look for the positive, and we can encourage that by starting our meetings that way and by ending our meetings that way. Because again, sometimes we end a meeting with, oh man, we didn't do anything right this month. Yes, we did. Here's a positive story. Natalia said, your story is full of life as it comes, discovering every minute that we will never be totally prepared for any event, neither know about possible outcomes. Exactly. The cards, yes, absolutely. We never know what those outcomes will be. And sometimes the outcome of the story doesn't come for weeks or months. When somebody comes back and says, I got the job, or I was able to FaceTime with my grandchild, or whatever it might be, you may not hear the full story initially. So start and end meetings. Sometimes just to pull out during a time like this and say, as somebody said, reminds us of our why, just pull them out again and take a look. We need that from time to time, don't we? Board meetings. Maybe whoever presents for your board takes a positive story every time. It never hurts to remind the board of how wonderful you all are. Friends meetings, same kind of a thing. Maybe you're trying to collaborate with somebody in the community, another organization, another social service agency. And I say another because that's kind of where libraries are living in these days. The space they live in is social service these days. So you take stories to show the collaborators or the partners that you'd like to join with why you think it would be a good fit and why you have the same goals as they do. So there are lots of good reasons and good ways to use those stories you're going to start collecting after today. So on page 2 of your handouts, 2 and part of 3 actually, I have listed many categories, departments, areas of your library that we might find stories in. So I'd like you to take a look at maybe the first, let's just say 3, because they kind of overlap. Think of a story in adult services. Yes, city commissioners, absolutely. Thank you, Yasmin. They need to be reminded, don't they? I can remember somebody telling me once at a workshop, she said, it's really hard to get funding from our city council because the last time I attended, I found out that nobody in the room had a library card. They weren't convinced of the importance of the library, were they? So absolutely, city commissioners. So think about adult services, the first 3 topics at the top of page 2, children's services, young adult. Share a story in the chat box. I'm going to give you a minute to think about that, and then we'll look at the next group. Adult services, children's, or young adult. As you're thinking, I'll share one that I heard. And again, it was a customer service workshop, which is where a lot of these percolate to the top. And we weren't even talking about stories, we were just talking about customer service. And a mom and her young child came in one day, a little boy, and he was on the autism spectrum. And typically she could find books for him and he would sit in the corner and just turn the pages quietly. But that day he happened to get ahead of her and he found one of their big reference books, a book that was so big and so valuable, nobody was allowed to check it out. And he wanted to take it home with him. And they were trying to explain to him, you can't take it home. We can sit here and look at the book. And he had a meltdown. And mom, you could see mom getting tenser and tenser. That's what they were sharing with me. And there were tears in her eyes. She didn't know how to handle it. And finally, the library director said, I've got an idea. Instead of you taking this book home and having to bring it back, I'm going to make you your own book. And so she took, I don't know how long it took a little while. She made copies of the pages that he liked in that book. And she put them together and she presented him with his own book. That's a story, folks. That's something that other people would never even think about. You think that built a bond? Do you think that developed loyalty with mom? Do you think that made that little boy's day, maybe his week? All of the above. And again, it may never have a monetary, quote, payoff, but it certainly has an emotional payoff. Marcia said, in circulation, we excuse late find as well as books that were lost. Absolutely, Marcia. And here's where you could delve a little bit deeper. There's probably a story in there somewhere of people that are having trouble buying food. And they were able to use the money that they would have had to pay for a fine or for a book that was lost to pay for their food or their electric bill or whatever. And again, that's why you don't have to worry about names. You just need to worry about here's how deeply we help our community. I see other attendees are typing, and then we're going to go on to the next category as soon as we see what they have to say. Broward County just complete free meals for children. There you go. In English cafe classes, we send email attachments so they can keep on learning their English. There you go. Yep. And always have your antenna up to look for the result of that. These are all the things that you do, and they're wonderful. But when you can get it down to one person and the impact you made, knowing that you made impact on dozens, if not hundreds, we already know that. But when you can get it down to the one person that you made a difference with. If I had told you the story about the little autistic boy and I just said, you know, if autistic children come into the library, they'll sometimes make copies for them, it wouldn't be as meaningful, would it? But you heard the pain of the mother and the angst that they went through because I told you his story. So that's what I want you to keep digging for as we think through some of these categories and places we can be looking for positive stories. And you won't come up with all of them today. I wouldn't expect you to. But now you have a source list of the things you can't be looking for. Megan said, we once helped a child who was new to reading books in English find a book that was just right for them. Okay, Megan, and here's how you flesh that out a little bit more. New to reading books in English. About how old was the child? What kind of book did they find that was just right for them? What was their attitude when you found that book? Do you see how you start to bring the emotions into it a little bit? And again, not to be manipulative in any way whatsoever. But if you want your stories to have impact, we have to get to the details that will have the impact, right? So I hope that helped, Megan, that you would just continue to flesh that out a little bit more. That's all. It's that easy. That took what, 3 seconds for me to ask that question? So, and you already have that information because you were there. You just don't think about it in those terms. So the next 3 categories on page 2, whoops, Yasmin said, we also write weekly emails to see how the students are doing. They get to give us their stories and we learn how we can help them. Yes. And then those are the stories without using names or real specific stuff, but you can say, this is the age. This child was about 11 years old and we were able to find him or her this book or whatever it was, and they did a report on it and got an A, and it was their first A of the semester. You know, whatever it is, it made an impact on their life. Library cards and e-cards, that's good. So technology, programs, and cataloging. Out of those three categories, can you think of anything specific that has created a story? Technology, programs, or cataloging? Technology, programs, or cataloging. The technology is rampant, and I know you all have ebooks and you help people with computers. Now we want to get specific. You help people with email and with their smartphones and their tablets and their apps and their games and all that kind of stuff, but we want to get specific. What's a story that touched your heart in an area of technology or programming? Sometimes it might be financial, sometimes it's health programming that you do, or gardening or hobbies. That's good, Nicole. I like that. Your story then comes in when somebody gets back to you to tell you what they did with the basic computer class, right? Because this is what you do as part of your job. Where's the story in that? Cooking lessons online. And then when you hear, oh, my 15-year-old cooked her first meal and she cooked for her grandparents and they raved about how good it was and she just glowed with pride. You see? That's how that pulls that out. Okay, so next three categories, and you can add to any of these, but I'm doing them three at a time so that it's easier for you to catch the idea. Circulation, reference, or collection development. Where's the story? Not what you do as part of your job. Where's the story about a person, about what the issue was that you were helping them with, and how you helped? So the next three were circulation, reference, and collection development, if you don't happen to have your handouts. The handouts would be very useful for after this webinar. Even if you didn't have them available during the webinar, they would be a great worksheet for your story collection development process. Margie said one of our younger librarians, who's quite savvy with technology, was enlisted to help a 99-year-old patron download his daily New York Times subscription as his condo complex had no internet connection. So on Sundays when the library is closed, he was able to download in our parking lot. I hope somebody drove him there, Margie, using the library wireless internet. That's phenomenal. There's so much in that story about how you're helping someone feel vital and valued. Oh, yes, which could be 80, right? That's great. I love that story. Now, I'm going to spin this a little bit, Margie, because as you collect stories in your library, you're going to have a story of a 9-year-old somewhere along the line for something, any of these categories. And I've got a couple dozen of them listed here. So when you go out to tell this story to somebody that has control of your purse strings or is trying to deny you doing a certain program, what a way to spin this. So let me tell you a little story. Did you remember that first slide I put up? It said once upon a time. I would love it if you even did that. Go to this meeting that you're going to have and say, once upon a time, a 9-year-old came into our library and she needed blah, blah, blah. And nobody thought the library would have that for her. But because we know our why and we know why we're in our community, here's what we did for her and here's what happened. But I'm not finished, because once upon another time, a 99-year-old came into our library and here's what we did for him. And why is that important? Because we not only engaged somebody in our community, we kept a 99-year-old engaged. We showed him he was valued. We showed him why his library is important in this community. Do you hear that? You just use the information you have. Not to be fake, because somebody mentioned authenticity right at the very beginning, and that's what we're talking about, isn't it? It's being authentic about how valuable we are. I can remember in a resume workshop, which isn't about stories, but in resumes, I always tell people that they just really have to write down what they've accomplished in past jobs on their resume in numbers and percentages and things like that, so that the people at the next job realize what they can do for them. And so I was going around the room one day and I was saying, okay, tell me something you accomplished at your job. And a lady told me, and she'd saved, I don't know, $82,000 for something at her job. And I said, that's perfect. That needs to go on your resume. She got really upset with me. She said, I would never put that on my resume. I said, why? And she said, because that's bragging. And I had to take a little bit of a breath. And I said, I understand that it feels like that. But if you don't put what you're able to accomplish and somebody else does, they get the job. And she just looked at me like, I'm not going to write it down. I don't think she ever did. I don't think she got a job either. So do you hear why it's so important for us to understand that? As I said, I had a mother call me for homework help for her son. I saw this as a great opportunity. I had an idea. Through FaceTime and with mother and son on the phone, I was able to help the student with his math homework. There you go. That reminded me of another story I heard at a workshop where a lady was talking about one of their staff members took a video of a child, of a mom who was incarcerated, took it to the prison to show the mom, and then they had an idea. And they said, if we bring the video camera here, would you read the next chapter in the book and we'll give it back to your daughter? And the mom was just stunned. So they started bringing in the video camera. They would video the prisoner, and she would read the next chapter or two or however many they decided on. They would take the video, give it to the daughter, and it actually was the granddaughter, so it was the mom of the incarcerated person. The little girl was living with her. And she would get to listen to her mom read the story to her. And then she'd read the next couple chapters. And oh my goodness, nobody would ever expect that, would they? Those are the kinds of things we're talking about. Next three categories. Any kind of services. You talked about faxing and scanning and copying. Any kind of administration. Any kind of maintenance that you helped. Now, here's a story for you under maintenance, because you wouldn't think that would have anything to do with anything. I was working in Alabama a few years ago, and the director was telling me about their custodian winning Employee of the Year for the entire city. And she said, I have to tell you this story. We had an older gentleman who would come in every Tuesday and Thursday. And he came in one Tuesday and he visited with the custodian like he always did, but he didn't show up on Thursday. And the custodian said, I'm really worried. He didn't say anything Tuesday that he wasn't going to be here on Thursday. And he said, I'm going to swing by his house after work. And he did. And the fellow was on the living room floor. He had fallen and he couldn't get up. And the custodian called 911 and essentially saved his life because nobody else was checking on him. And that's why he won Employee of the Year for the city. You wouldn't think maintenance would have anything to do with anything. Not that their jobs are any less, but they're just not visible, are they? Like whoever said earlier, I'm not out with the public as much. I don't see the patrons as much. But whatever you're doing within the library has an effect on your patrons' lives, doesn't it? Brent said, I just had a work emergency. I had to step away from the computer. Is this being recorded? Yes, it is, Brent. Good. Yeah, you'll get to see that. Yes, Taylor records those for us. I'm glad you were able to come back to us. So those last three categories were services like faxing or scanning or copying. And a couple of you have already mentioned that. Administration of any kind or any kind of maintenance. Categories or departments or areas of the library that we wouldn't have thought of having an actual story. So if you think of anything, go ahead and type that in. I'm going to move along because I know we still have some things to cover here. Human resources, special collections or archives, digital services or collections. So that category of three is human resources, special collections or archives, or any kind of digital services or collections. I hope everything's okay with the emergency, Brent. Right now would be a great way for people a great time for people, some of the people that have been laid off or whatever, to digitize some of their memories. I got a digital picture frame a couple years ago, and I spent probably a month of Sundays, literally just on Sunday, scanning a bunch of notes from my late husband, scanning pictures of the family, and I put them on my digital picture frame. And you know what? I haven't looked at it much since then. I looked at them the first 2 or 3 months, but it's on my desk, and when I do want something, it's right there. It took some time to do that, and I had to learn the process. Boy, do I wish one of you would have been here with me, that it would have made it easier. But those are the kinds of things we help people with, aren't they? And did you hear me mention that that was from my late husband? So not only do I have pictures on there, I actually have his handwritten notes on there, which are incredible. So those categories were human resources, special collections or archives, and digital services and or collections. And then we'll move on to the next three categories if nothing pops up for us here. Don't forget, we're not just talking about during the pandemic either. And I know that is just what is so soaked into our minds right now. And certainly it will be rich with stories that you will be able to tell for years. But you've had stories brewing all along, haven't you? So don't be afraid to reach back into your mental archives and pull out some of those stories. So the next three categories, I know you're going to have something on: events, everyday activities, or any kind of collaborations that you do that people wouldn't expect. A story that came out of any of those, an event that you've held, an everyday activity that you go about, it's just my job, I didn't think anything of it. Partnerships or collaborations with maybe workforce board or social services agencies. When I put everyday activities, one of the things I put in my own little notes was self-esteem. How often do you help people's self-esteem? By helping them learn how to use an iPad or how to FaceTime or how to set up an email account or how to file something digitally so they can apply for a job. There's an issue there that you don't always think about. That's the self-esteem issue of how good you make somebody feel about themselves. Events, everyday activities, partnerships or collaborations. Anything popping to mind? Okay, next three categories. Friends of the library. Actually, it's going to be four because this will round up our categories. And I have extra lines there for you. If you can think of any other categories, please fill them in and tell us in the chat box so we can add to our own worksheets that we are going to use in the future, aren't we? Yes, we are. So the last four categories are Friends of the Library stories, library board stories, security stories, or senior adult services stories. Anything in those four categories: friends of the library, your library board, security, or senior adult services. Or any other categories that came to mind for you in your library that I haven't mentioned out of the couple of dozen that I mentioned. Oh, there's a story there, Nicole. I'm not sure what the actual story is. Coworkers in other departments that are anti-library. Okay, so I'm not sure I want to know that story. I'm not sure that's a story we would want to share with anybody, right? Maybe in other city departments, I hope you mean, not in library departments. Okay, good. That's a positive. But the story would be when they find the value, right? That's where your story is. When they do realize the value of the library. Because sometimes, honestly, people who think a library is just a library is just a library, once they get something from the library that they had no idea they even needed, much less that the library would offer, they become the biggest advocates sometimes, don't they? Oh, I totally agree that HR should include the library in the onboarding sessions. And wouldn't your story collection be wonderful there? At an onboarding session where you pick out a few, maybe if they have them once a month, you pick out 2 or 3 stories to share with HR that they get to share with the people that are being onboarded. That would be incredible. I would love to see that kind of a use. You know what? That builds that bond, doesn't it, Nicole? The thing that we were talking about earlier. We're trying to create bonds not just with our community, we're trying to create bonds with the people that we're interconnected with in our jobs. So that would definitely create a bond if they saw what the library was doing in the community and how important it is. I know you all have stories about things like the ARP tax service, services to the homebound, things like that. Just keep thinking of them. This is not over when this webinar ends today. This is not over ever, as long as you're still at the library or you're still advocating for the library, even if you retire. This should go on because those stories are still going to be out there, aren't they? Okay, so I've alluded to what you need to include in your story, but let's look specifically at what the key components are. Jamie LaRue, who used to work for the Colorado Library, I think the Colorado State Library maybe. Anyway, and then he worked for ALA and now he's off on his own. But anyway, he put together an hour-long webinar for WebJunction several years ago, and I had listened to that, and he told stories within that webinar. And his webinar was not actually about storytelling, it was about advocating. Advocacy for funding, getting levies passed, that kind of thing. I'm going to read these stories here. Yasmin said an English cafe student called me saying his father had to take a citizenship test and that it was his third and last time. She said, please help me. I hear the emotion in that just reading it. I went to our library collection, found civic questions in English and Spanish, a DVD on how to answer the questions, as well as some citizenship literature. Called her, checked out the DVD on her son's library card, called her to come by the library and call me when she was outside, put all the materials in the trunk. She thanked me. I felt really good helping her. If you have any way to contact her, Yasmin, and not even as part of your storytelling, although it would be great, but think how special she will feel if you follow up and ask how it went when you know enough time has passed. Again, whether it was a positive or I hope not a negative outcome it might have been, she will feel good that you cared enough to check back in. So if you can, without violating any privacy or anything, I know as a human being, she would appreciate that. Brent said, we had a mail person come by our branch and notify us that someone on his route needed a welfare check. Oh, wow, that is really cool. We then called police non-emergency to have the welfare check done. We never knew what ended up happening, but it was important to help someone in our community. Yes. And if you happen to see the mail person again, you can always check in, can't you, Brent? And just say, we aren't going to, probe or anything. We don't want to be nosy. We just want to make sure everybody's okay. He hasn't said next month is when he'll be taking it. I'll be certainly following up. Great. I'm glad to hear that. Love to hear that. So what are the key components? Well, first thing is, as I've mentioned earlier, it needs to be a real person, doesn't it? Not just a group of people. We always help our seniors do this. We always help people at story time. We always help people who are unemployed. I know that, and a lot of people know that. Some people don't, but it won't really be an impact unless there's a person involved. It might be two people, a sister and a brother, or a mom and a son, like I was describing earlier, or something like that. But you get the drift, not just a general group of people, because that just goes over people's heads. They don't really pay attention to that, do they? So the real person, what the problem or issue or situation is, what are you supposed to be helping with, what's the concern going on, how the library intervened. And when I say intervention, how did you assist to make a positive outcome? And this isn't meant for you to take the focus onto the library. The story is about the people involved. All you're doing is saying, this is everything that happened, and here's how the library helped. This is the people that were involved, and here's how the library helped. And what was the result? And sometimes you don't get it, like some of you have mentioned. You don't ever see that person again. You don't know what happened. But when the custodian realized the fellow didn't come in on Thursday and went to check up on him, that wasn't really about the library per se, was it? It was about the heart of the library. And even then, that wasn't the focus. The focus was on a citizen in our community needed help, and somebody paid attention and helped. And because of that, his life was saved. So that's what we're talking about, a real person, whatever the situation might have been, or problem, or concern, or issue, how the library helped in a supporting role, if you will, and then what was the result. And if you can, Sometimes when you're in an appropriate situation, like at the board meeting or you're defending a grant application, a phrase that pays, the American Library Association calls it, libraries transform lives. I've had people say libraries save lives. Libraries connect families when they have a story where family members caught up with each other somehow, whatever it might be. That's what we're talking about here. So as we wrap up today, I'd like you to use your worksheet and actually start the process of creating a story that has happened in your library. I didn't mean creating from a standpoint of making it up. I just meant you're going to start that download of the information you have in your heads, and I know there's a ton of it. I want you to start downloading that onto your worksheet, thinking about your stories. This is at the bottom of page 3. So, what is your story? At the bottom of page 3, it asks for a real person and the problem or concern or issue you were addressing. So go ahead and fill that in on the worksheet. Who is the person? You don't have to give a name, a fairly specific description about whether it was a child, whether it was an adult, whether it was a teen, whatever it might have been. And the issue is at the bottom of page 3. We'll start with that. So hopefully you have A and B completed at the bottom of page 3. If you turn your page over or go on to the next page, C is my library's intervention. I know who the person was. I know what the situation was. How did the library help in this situation? Go ahead and fill that in. What was the result? What actually happened after the library helped? And then just for fun, and you don't have to do this right now, but if you can just in your own mind think of the phrase that pays, and of course we know it might not pay money, but it does get people's attention for libraries. If you can come up with that as well, that's just the fun part of it. And I left that off of the next 2 segments because you're not going to come up with a dozen different kinds of phrases that pay. You might have a couple though, but you should be able to come up with several stories using your worksheets. So is it coming together for you? Type into the chat box what you've got so far. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't even have to be complete, but what do you have so far? What has come to mind for you about a real person, a real situation, how your library helped? Doesn't even have to be you, but how somebody in your library helped, and then what the result was. The result becomes real important too, doesn't it? Because what we do makes us feel good, but what makes us feel like we actually accomplished something is when we know there was a result. And let's go back to the citizenship test. Whether or not that person is able to pass, because that's such a huge challenge, the result is you gave them the tools that they needed. The daughter was able to help the dad, and that's why your library is there. And of course, if he does pass, that is phenomenal, and that should be shouted from the rooftops and put on a laminated index card in a neon color. Brent said, on break, I was at a bakery getting snacks for the branch. I overheard a Spanish person asking about where he could use Wi-Fi. I told him he could come by our branch and use the Wi-Fi. After 15 minutes of hearing him vent about this recent experience of being homeless, how he had to sleep on the golf course, and how he had just been evicted, We found him information about evictions, got in touch with the social worker with his permission. He left our branch with information about shelters and information and legal aid that could help him with his eviction issue. Knowing he was spending the night outside and had no place to go was a reminder we can help, but not always solve problems. Absolutely, Brent. And you bring up another good point. Sometimes people don't want to make the choices that will solve their problems, and that's their choice. Sometimes people don't want to make those choices because sometimes they're tough choices and you have to make an effort. But you were the hero in my book by offering things that could help them make those choices if they chose to do so. Yeah, you can tell people where to donate and when of books that might be helpful. So have you come up with an idea about how you're going to honor your library stories by telling them? How are you going to use them? Are you going to actually start documenting them? Margie said we had an older volunteer who was taking a taxi to come to the library, his volunteer service. Oh my gosh. Staff stepped in and picked him up and dropped him off on his volunteer days. That's incredible. Another volunteer stepped forward and was able to coordinate her schedule to volunteer on the same day as the older gentleman. They developed a nice friendship over this experience. And they would not have done that without the library. And that person who didn't have a way to get there to volunteer now feels valuable because first the library stepped in and then another volunteer stepped in. And the second volunteer feels valuable because they're helping somebody else fulfill their mission in life. You have a loop-de-loop story, Margie. I think that's a new term I just created, but it loops for several different people, doesn't it? Because you've got people helping people who help people. That's incredible. Okay, I know we're getting close to the end of our program, and I just want to ask if you have any questions for me. You always have my email address at the bottom of the first page of your handouts. If you need more information or you're trying to flesh out a story that you know could make some impact, drop me an email. I'm always happy to help with that, and I love hearing your stories. So please feel free to do that. And please be sure to leave here today determined to start collecting your library stories in a way that will become just a habit. And honest to goodness, if it becomes a habit, there won't be time constraints because it will be a 60-second process of jotting down the person details, the situation details, how you helped, and what the result was. It doesn't, yes, people helping people. Remember that song, I Want to Teach the World to Sing? That's what we're doing here. We're teaching the world to sing by telling their stories. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. If there's any way I can help, reach out. I love to do that. Keep collecting your stories and keep knowing how valuable you are in your community.
Thank you, Linda, for an informative webinar this afternoon. Attendees, if you enjoyed this webinar, we ask that you join us on August 26th for Linda Bruno's next webinar, which is going to be part 1 of a 2-part webinar, Solving the Personality Puzzle. As always, we encourage you to keep an eye on the Swiftland CE calendar, the Swiftland Facebook page, or your message from the listserv. Thank you everyone for attending and have a great rest of your day. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Deb.